There is something about Georgia in the 1970s that people who lived through it cannot forget. It was a time when the Old South was slowly becoming the New South, and the state felt like the center of the world for a little while. If you close your eyes, you can probably still feel that thick, humid air on a July evening. You can see the red clay dust covering the tires of a station wagon. You might remember the smell of pine trees baking in the sun or the sweet scent of roasting peanuts. You can hear the sound of cicadas buzzing loudly in the trees just before the sun went down. You remember the pride of seeing a peanut farmer from Plains become the President of the United States. You remember the music of the Allman Brothers Band drifting out of an open window. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like in Georgia during that unforgettable decade. Let's step into that world. If you lived in Georgia back then, you know that the state felt like two different worlds. There was the growing, busy city of Atlanta, and then there was everything else. In the rural towns, life moved very slowly. You drove past miles of peach orchards and cotton fields. The roads were often narrow and lined with deep ditches. In the small towns, the courthouse square was still the main gathering place. People in the country and smaller cities like Macon or Columbus felt a strong connection to the land. You might have known families who still worked on farms. The red clay soil was everywhere. It stained your shoes, your clothes, and your car. If you played baseball in a sandlot, you came home covered in that red dust. It was a mark of growing up in Georgia. Atlanta, however, was becoming something huge. It was called the city too busy to hate. If you visited Atlanta in the 70s, you saw the skyline changing every year. New skyscrapers were going up, reaching for the clouds. The Peachtree Plaza Hotel opened, and it looked like a giant glass cylinder shining in the sun. It was the tallest hotel in the world for a short time, and everyone wanted to see it. For many people, work was steady but hard. In the northern part of the state, the carpet mills in Dalton were booming. People called Dalton the carpet capital of the world. If you lived there, you likely worked in a mill or knew someone who did. In other towns, textile factories and car assembly plants provided good jobs. You could graduate high school on a Friday and start a factory job on Monday. The economy had its ups and downs, especially later in the decade. You remember when gas prices started to climb. In 1973 and 1979, the gas shortages hit Georgia hard. You might remember waiting in long lines at the gas station. Sometimes the line would stretch down the block. You hoped the station would not run out of fuel before you got to the pump. Despite the gas crisis, Georgians loved their cars. Muscle cars were still popular early in the decade. You saw Pontiac Firebirds and Chevrolet Camaros roaring down the highways. But families mostly drove big station wagons. These cars were like boats on wheels. They had wood grain on the sides and vinyl seats that got scorching hot in the summer. Kids did not wear seatbelts in the back of those wagons. You might have sat in the very back, in the rear-facing seat, making faces at the drivers behind you. On long trips to the Golden Isles or Florida, the parents smoked in the front seat while the windows were rolled down. The wind roared so loud you had to shout to be heard. Politics was a huge part of daily conversation in the 1970s. You felt a special kind of pride because of Jimmy Carter. He was one of your own. He wasn't a slick politician from a big city. He was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. When he ran for president in 1976, it felt like the whole state was behind him. You remember seeing Jimmy Carter for president bumper stickers on trucks and cars everywhere. When he won, it felt like Georgia had won. People felt that the rest of the country finally respected the South. Even if you didn't agree with all his politics later, that moment of victory was sweet. It made you feel like anything was possible. This was also a time of changing social rules. Integration was settling in. Schools that had been separate were now mixed. In Atlanta, Maynard Jackson became the first African-American mayor of a major southern city in 1973. It was a time of progress. While things were not perfect, you could feel the hope in the air. People were trying to build a new future together. If you were a sports fan, 1974 was the year you will never forget. That was the year Hank Aaron broke the home run record. Everyone was watching the Atlanta Braves. On that April night, when Hammerin' Hank hit number 715, the stadium went wild. Even if you were watching on a fuzzy color TV at home, you cheered. It was a moment of pure history happening right in your backyard. Food was the center of family life. In Georgia, you didn't just eat, you had a feast. Sunday dinner was a mandatory event. You went to church in the morning, and then you went to Grandma's house. The table would be groaning with food. There was fried chicken, of course, crispy and hot. You had collard greens, black-eyed peas, and cornbread made in a cast-iron skillet. And there was always sweet tea. In Georgia, tea wasn't just a drink. It was like syrup. It was so sweet it could make your teeth ache. But it was the only thing that cooled you down. For dessert, there was peach cobbler or pecan pie made with nuts from a tree in the yard. If you lived in or near Atlanta, you went to the Varsity. You remember the servers shouting. You ordered a chili dog and onion rings. The onion rings were greasy and delicious. You washed it down with a frosted orange drink. It was fast, loud, and wonderful. Shopping was changing too. The old downtown main streets were starting to get a little quieter. The big action was at the Mall. If you lived in Atlanta, you went to Lenox Square or Cumberland Mall. Malls were the place to be. They had air conditioning, which was a luxury. You could spend the whole Saturday just walking around the mall with your friends. You remember the department stores like Rich's. Rich's was not just a store, it was an institution. The staff treated you like royalty. Buying school clothes, there was a yearly tradition. You got your feet measured for new shoes, and maybe you got a new pair of tough denim jeans. Music was everywhere in the 70s. Georgia was the heart of Southern rock. Macon was the headquarters for Capricorn Records. You felt cool just knowing that the Allman Brothers Band walked the same streets as you. Songs like Ramblin' Man and Midnight Rider played on every radio station. It wasn't just rock, though. Country music was huge. And in 1979, the state officially made Ray Charles's version of Georgia on My Mind the state song. Hearing that song made you tear up a little. It captured the soul of the state perfectly. In Athens, a new music scene was just starting to bubble up with bands like the B-52s, but that was just the beginning. Housing in Georgia was mostly single-story ranch houses. They were made of brick and built to last. Most had a big front yard and a big backyard. In the early 70s, not everyone had central air conditioning. You might have had a big attic fan that pulled air through the house. You slept with the windows open, listening to the crickets. Neighbors knew each other. You sat on the front porch in the evening. People waved when they drove by. Doors were often left unlocked during the day. It felt safe. If you were a kid, the neighborhood was your kingdom. You rode your bicycle everywhere. Childhood in 1970s, Georgia was lived outside. You came home from school, changed your clothes, and went out. You played in the woods, building forts out of fallen branches. You rode bikes over jumps made of plywood and bricks. You played kickball in the cul-de-sac until the streetlights buzzed on. School was strict but simple. Teachers did not tolerate bad behavior. You started the day with the Pledge of Allegiance. Lunch cost about 40 or 50 cents. You remember the square pizza and the chocolate milk in a carton. If you got in trouble at school, you knew you would be in more trouble when you got home. Weekends were for the outdoors. If you had a boat, you went to Lake Lanier or Lake Allatoona. The lakes were crowded with families water skiing. The water was warm and muddy. You spent all day in the sun and went home exhausted and sunburned. If you are enjoying this trip back in time and want to help keep these memories alive, you can support this channel by subscribing or becoming a member. It means a lot to people who love remembering these years. Camping was also popular. You might have gone to the North Georgia mountains. The air was cooler up there. You pitched a heavy canvas tent and cooked bacon over a fire. Or maybe you went to Stone Mountain. You remember watching the laser show on the side of the mountain. It was magical to sit on the grass and watch the lights. Theme parks were a big deal. Six Flags Over Georgia was the place every kid wanted to go. You remember the Great Gasp parachute drop. It looked terrifyingly high. You remember the Mind Bender roller coaster. Waiting in line was part of the fun. The smell of asphalt and cotton candy is something you can still recall. The weather in Georgia was always a topic of conversation. The summers were brutal. The humidity wrapped around you like a wet blanket. You sweat just by standing still, but the winters were usually mild. You didn't own a heavy coat, just a jacket. However, you remember the snow jam of 1973. It was a rare event. Snow fell in Atlanta and suddenly the whole city shut down. People abandoned their cars on the interstate. For kids, it was a miracle. You scraped together enough snow to make a tiny snowman. It melted the next day, but you never forgot it. Holidays in Georgia were special. Christmas was not complete without a trip to see the great tree at Rich's in downtown Atlanta. It was a real tree, huge and full of lights, on top of the glass bridge. Families drove from hours away just to see it. You also remember the Pink Pig. It was a little monorail train for kids that ran through the toy department at Rich's. Riding the Pink Pig was a rite of passage. If you didn't ride it, it didn't feel like Christmas. The Sears Wish Book catalog would arrive, and you would circle the toys you wanted. Grocery shopping was a weekly ritual with your mom. You went to the Piggly Wiggly, the A&P, or the Big Star. You remember the stamps, S and H green stamps. Your mom collected them religiously. She pasted them into little books. When she had enough books, you went to the redemption center to trade them for a toaster or a lamp. It felt like getting something for free. Technology was simple. You had a landline phone on the wall in the kitchen. It had a long, curly cord that was always tangled. If you wanted to talk to your girlfriend or boyfriend, you had to whisper because your parents were in the next room. There was no internet, no video games at home yet. You had 3 or 4 TV channels. You had to get up to change the channel. In the late 70s, things like microwave ovens started appearing in kitchens. They were huge and heavy. People were afraid to stand too close to them. But mostly, life was analog. You listened to records. You took photos with a camera that used film, and you had to wait a week to see the pictures. The fashion was something else. In the early 70s, it was bell-bottoms and polyester shirts with big collars. The colors were earth tones, avocado green, harvest gold, and burnt orange. By the late 70s, disco style was creeping in. But in Georgia, blue jeans and t-shirts were always the standard. There was a feeling of community that is hard to explain to young people today. Churches were the social hubs, especially in small towns. Wednesday night supper at the church was where you caught up on all the local gossip. You knew who was sick, who was having a baby, and whose business was struggling. You helped each other. The 70s in Georgia were not just about the big events. It was about the quiet moments. It was sitting on the tailgate of a truck watching the sunset. It was catching fireflies in a jar. It was the taste of a cold Coca-Cola from a glass bottle. As the decade came to a close, Georgia had changed. Atlanta was an international city. The quiet, rural life was shrinking as suburbs expanded. The pace of life was speeding up. The 80s were coming with their malls and new technology. But for those who remember Georgia in those years, there is always more history to explore. It was a time when the state found its voice. It was a time of peaches, politics, and pride. The memories of that red clay and those warm nights will stay with you forever.